So here at Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give the talks. Usually, today we have a special guest coming to us live from Austin. For those of you who are new, the way it usually works is we have a planning meeting every quarter, and it's open to the whole community where we brainstorm ideas for talks we want to hear or we want to give. And we just had that last week, but when we have it again, everyone is welcome. All right, today, I hope you will join me in welcoming ObjectivelyDan, Dan Earls, to give a talk about anecdotes from real life street epistemologist.
Hi, everybody. How's it going? I go by the online moniker of ObjectivelyDan, and I wanted to talk to you guys today about street epistemology. Maybe you guys have heard of it before. To give a short description of street epistemology, it's an organized method of talking to people about their beliefs. And so it's very interesting when you've been a part of the atheist community. I don't know how long you guys have been here, just been doing it for a few years now, but it's a community that, I would say overall values science and values good ways of thinking, good ways of being skeptical and being critical. But I often find that when it comes to conversations with people tend to use the same old tricks or the same old kind of rhetoric and the same old tactics that have been demonstrated through science not to work time and time again. The science of how and why people change their beliefs is still mostly a mystery, but there's definitely some things out there that we know don't especially work too well. And I'm going to get into some of specifically what those are. But first, I want to talk about my story a little bit, because my story as to how I became an atheist is directly involved with the method of street epistemology. So some of you guys, if you know who I am, you might know my story. I had a conversation with a guy named Anthony Magnabosco a couple of years ago. And Anthony Magnabosco has kind of been the face of street epistemology unofficially now for a couple of years. He's been having these conversations with people using street epistemology that he has, like with people on the street, on YouTube, and he's been doing it for a couple of years now. And I happened to be one of those people at the time. I was a Christian who was a part of an evangelical college group, and I was on my way to a meeting with a friend of mine when Anthony kind of stopped me when I was on my college campus. And it was an interesting conversation I had with him. The first link in the chat there, if you are interested in seeing it, I posted what that conversation was. It's about 30 minutes long, but you can see I was a full-fledged Christian, just living my life. And he had this way of asking me about my beliefs and why I believe the things that I did in a way that I hadn't really encountered before, and it was really curious. I hadn't encountered anything quite like it. And I had never really forgotten about that conversation. And so when I became an atheist about a year or so later, I got back in touch with Anthony. I found out who he was because I didn't know. I just remembered I had a conversation with this guy. I didn't have a card or anything anymore. And that's when I found out, oh, this whole street epistemology thing, this is a whole kind of movement of people using this method to talk to people about their beliefs. So I had a follow-up conversation with him basically right after I deconverted, and you can watch that on his channel as well. But I got really curious and eventually got into researching the method even more. And now I've given a version of this talk before that's about an hour long. That's on my personal YouTube channel. The other link to that is also up above, which you can see the full hour-long length of. But this is going to be a very much condensed version of this, just to give you guys an idea of what it is and how you can use it and why you should use a method like this. And so what we're talking about is, again, a method of talking to people. Now, people have been talking about methods of talking to people since like Dale Carnegie, right? Like how to win friends and influence people. And so you can take these principles and they've been used for all kinds of things, you know, sales and professional life and stuff like that, but they haven't always necessarily been used to talk to people about their beliefs in something. So that's one draw of where this method comes from. The other method of where this method comes from, the kind of ideas where it comes from, is the idea of the Socratic method of talking to people. If you've ever read anything from Socrates, he goes on like these walks with people and kind of asks them these big questions on why they believe stuff. I'd say, I get this question of what's the difference between the Socratic method and straight epistemology, because they seem to be kind of similar. And the answer I give is Socrates, in using his method, was meant to, he was trying to make a point a lot of times. He was using his method as sort of a rhetorical technique in some cases, whereas in straight epistemology, your goal typically is just to examine the other person's belief, give them the spotlight and the expertise on their own beliefs and why they believe it. And your job isn't to necessarily convince people one way or the other if their beliefs are true. Because when we're examining beliefs, there are beliefs that people can have, and they might be valid. We can think of tons of examples of this, but if your belief is like climate change is real, I'm going to use that one because I'm assuming everyone in this particular audience shares that belief, right? If I was to use straight epistemology on you, I would hope that you would still come to the conclusion at the end of the day that climate change is real. It's not necessarily meant to change someone's mind every time. It's just meant to kind of examine people's beliefs. And while we're talking about confusion on street epistemology, I'll go ahead and clear this up as well. Some people get this idea that street epistemology can only be used when you're out on the street or you're talking to strangers or you're on a camera, and that's not necessarily true either. The people in the street epistemology community intend for this method to be used anywhere. So Thanksgiving is coming up, and maybe you don't want to interrogate, your parents or your friends or whoever about, certain kinds of politics or religious ideas that you're just going to get into an argument to. So you can almost use this method as a reflexive self-defense technique is how I like to think about it, rather than choosing to get into a debate with somebody and know where people's lids are going to fly off as soon as you start getting into it. You can use this method to really diffuse very difficult topics of conversation. If you look at Anthony's channel, for example, Anthony Magnabosco's YouTube channel, you'll find that at the end of almost every conversation, people really walk away from it smiling. Like they really do enjoy this. This is different from some other people who go out on the street and saying like, oh, I changed my mind. Those tend to be more confrontational. It's not really the goal with street epistemology. We're not trying to attack people for their beliefs. We're just trying to examine the reasons why people believe something, because I think we can inherently recognize that people go and do certain actions because of their beliefs. I don't know if I have to prove my point beyond that, right? Like beliefs inform our everyday actions. You go to church because you like the community and the people around them. If you're a Christian, you go because you like the community, but also you want to praise God. I don't go to a Christian church because I'm not a Christian anymore. My beliefs aren't in that same circle. So, the variety of the applications of this technique are basically limitless. And I encourage anybody to at least look at this technique. If you're not following it completely, at least get some of the ideas from it and don't fall into some of the same similar traps that a lot of people get into when they talk about this. So let's talk about the method itself. The method itself can be explained pretty simply by a triangle. So for this version of the talk, I'm not presenting any visuals, but I want you to imagine in your mind a triangle, and I wanted that triangle to be divided horizontally into 3 slices, right? Kind of like the old food pyramid was, where it was divided horizontally. There's 3 different sections. On the top, we have belief. On the middle row, we have reasons. And on the bottom row, we have method. Okay, so this is kind of the belief triangle is what I like to call it. Some people call it different things, but I call it the belief triangle: belief, reasons, and method. And this is a way of, kind of a reference for you to use when you're having a conversation with street epistemology kind of style. You want to organize the conversation in a way where you can examine the points and examine the claims that the interlocutor or the person you're talking to is making in such a way that you can kind of follow this method every time you're having a conversation, so you don't get lost in the muck and the mire. The advantage of using street epistemology is you don't have to be very well advanced in philosophy to know this. You don't have to know about world religions. You don't have to know anything. Besides, outside of this triangle, if you can stick to it, you can talk about pretty much any kind of belief and still get a meaningful conversation out of it. So going back to the triangle, at the top we have belief. This is the questions you're asking about. Another way to put belief is the what. You're kind of asking the what questions. This is where you're starting off in the conversation. So the what questions are defining the actual belief. So let's say I'm talking to somebody, and we'll just use the God claim, for example. They say, well, I believe in God. Okay, well, very simply, the first thing you should ask is, well, what God? Which God, right? I don't think I have to reiterate to a group such as yourself that, yeah, there's different ideas about what God is, right? Are we talking about Yahweh? Are we talking about Vishnu? Are we talking about Odin? What do you mean when that person says God? And so it occupies the top part of this triangle because you're going to spend the least amount of time in this. Hopefully, you define your terms pretty quickly, and then you move on. Sometimes the conversation delves more into that. And the talk that I usually give has a full conversation of which we analyze each parts of it. But for now, we're going to go with this hypothetical conversation. So the person said, I believe in God. You're asking, okay, which God? And they're saying, well, I believe in the Christian God. The one true God, right? I mean, he is the only one. Okay, so right there, the atheist instinct in you might be able to say, well, no, because that's just one cultural construct of God. There's multiple different kinds of gods. Okay, so you don't want to go that route. You're not trying to get into an argument with somebody about the semantics of something. You're treating this person as if they're the expert of their own belief. Okay, so they have this God belief. They believe that not only is the Christian God real, he's the only God, all other gods are false, right? Okay, so you're just getting information from this. Try not to fight back. Just let people talk about what they believe, and I promise you this method is going to be able to get you to a place where you can get them to expound on that more and get them to think about that belief. So we're going to go to the next part of this triangle. Remember at the top we had beliefs. We're asking the what questions. Second part, we're asking the reasons. These are the why questions that we want to get into, okay? So for a God belief, this is very simple. You can just ask, well, why do you believe in God, right? This is one of the easier topics to kind of use street epistemology on. Other beliefs, they can get more complicated. And in a second here, when I'm done with explaining this stuff to you, when we go around talking about it, I'm happy to answer any questions about specific kinds of conversations and what I would ask. But this one's pretty simple. Why do you believe in God? Well, they could give a number of answers, right? They could say, well, it's what my family believed in, so that's what I believe. I grew up as a Christian, that's pretty common. Or, maybe they studied some apologetics a little bit, and they might say, well, I believe it because the Gospels count as eyewitness testimony to the risen Lord Jesus, and anybody who doesn't think otherwise is a fool. Again, I'm giving these kind of provocative answers because that's sometimes what you encounter, but you don't want to be provoked. This isn't a method for you to get into an argument with someone. It's a method for you to examine. So just put that into the back of your mind for now. Don't let that bother you. But take that in as, okay, this is their belief. Almost think of it as like you're a sociologist trying to study someone's, a person's culture and their identity. This is a way for you to be reflective rather than reactive in some ways. So the reasons part of the conversation is going to spend a bit more time on, you're going to spend a bit more time on, because you want to figure out why they believe in this thing. Maybe they haven't thought about it. Maybe they don't have a good reason, but try to figure out the best reason. So maybe they'll give a reason and they'll say, oh, it's because of the four gospels. And you might want to say, well, is that your best reason? Is that your biggest reason? Are there other reasons? You want to know which ones, because we're going to be examining those reasons, and we just want to pick one for right now as we are looking at it. And that's what you want to give your attention and focus to. And this is also a good point to remind you that a conversation like this, mine with Anthony, it lasted 30 minutes. It could have lasted even more. This is something that you want to have patience with, and maybe not rush to get to what you want to do as quickly as possible. enjoy the flow of the conversation a bit. And my advice also is, at least at first, try to keep your own opinions about things, to yourself as much as possible unless asked. Because, again, we want to focus on the other person. They're the expert. They're the ones kind of explaining their ideas. And that's what we want to give credence to. We want to listen to them before we're listening to ourselves. So as we're kind of checking on the time here, I want to make sure that I'm not breaking any rules by going over. We're going to get to the last part of this method. And again, a very simplified kind of explanation of what I'm doing here. But the last part, the biggest part of this triangle, is method. So again, looking at the triangle, belief, reasons, and method. We're at the bottom chunk of this triangle. I guess it's a pyramid. You know what I mean when I'm saying this, right? The method is when we're asking the how questions. The how questions are different from the why questions. The how questions, again, are examining the method by which they chose certain reasons to explain their belief. Not necessarily implying that they're choosing it as sort of an act of free will, right? But what became convincing to them? Why were these reasons particularly convincing as opposed to reasons for something else? And that's what we're kind of looking at. And people also get confused when you're asking these kinds of questions. They don't have to begin with why or what or how. These are just a general type of questions. So going back to our example, this person, they've studied some apologetics. They said, the four Gospels as eyewitness testimony are proof to me that God is real. Already, we can acknowledge that philosophically that might not make sense, right? But your goal isn't to say, oh, that doesn't make sense because here's why, right? You're not edifying in that moment. You're just trying to ask questions as much as you can through this. And so a good how question for this particular scenario, this kind of four gospel scenario, is like, how did you determine that the four gospels were eyewitness testimony? Or how did you determine that the four gospels necessarily led to a God belief and not a different kind, because, right, we're already talking about how Jesus could rise from the dead, and that doesn't necessarily mean God is real, right? I mean, you've heard these kinds of versions of this, but putting that into a form of question would be like, how are the four gospels, how is the best explanation for the four gospels that Jesus is real versus something else? And again, like, this method can be used for non-religious ideas. They can be used to ask why somebody is an atheist, what reasons they have for that, right? But, try not to make it seem like you are trying to make your own point, like you're trying to argue for something else. This is something to try to figure out why someone believes in what they do, what people believe and why. That's kind of the motto of my show, in which I talk about this stuff. Because we don't want to give the impression that we're only having this conversation because I'm going to change your mind about something today. That's not how I approach the conversations, and I encourage you not to do the same thing. This is a sort of neutral method of examining beliefs. And the how portion of this conversation is going to probably take up the longest part. And keep in mind, you might also go back to the why questions or maybe back to the what questions as you're doing it. But the vast majority of the conversation is probably going to spend time in this how space. And again, normally this is a part of the talk where I show you a video example and we kind of go over it. And in a second here, I'd love to see if you guys want to try some street epistemology on me, or if you'd like for me to try it on you. That's how I would, how I like to do these sorts of things. But this is the street epistemology method in a nutshell. What, why, and how. And if you stick to this methodology, I tend to find that my conversations are much more fruitful and much more meaningful than just two people shouting at each other in 180 characters on Twitter. It turns out, if you try to show somebody, let's say somebody's a creationist and they say, oh, the Earth's only 6,000 years old. And you say, oh, actually, no, here's what a scientist wrote about this. That tends to never, ever change somebody's mind, right? Because it doesn't matter if you're right. Sometimes what matters is if you're persuasive. Being right and being persuasive are kind of two different things. And in that particular instance, you're suffering from what's called the backfire effect, Whereas if you already have a belief in something and somebody is showing you contradictory evidence of that belief, something that would disconfirm that belief of being true, there's a tendency in human beings to reject that and dig even harder in their own beliefs. So not only are you not acting in your own interests, that is your interest being to change someone's mind, but you're also like making it worse for people to even come to a different conclusion about their beliefs if you're not fully considering somebody's, psychology in the matter. And this would be a part of the conversation where I would tell you guys, some other kind of psychological tips and tricks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that afterwards. But even if you don't adopt street epistemology, even if you think that there's other methods, I would encourage you to try to be consistent in figuring out some method of talking to people rather than just random crapshoots. Because if there's one thing I would change about the atheist community today, it would be in how we actually have conversations with people, because I do think that there's room for improvement. I think that there's ways that we can present these ideas without, throwing the person we're talking to under the bus and having to, there's room for shame sometimes, but not all the time, right? Like obviously there's room for ridicule as well, but not all the time. Anybody who has like a racist belief, right? Of course, I'm not going to appreciate that. I'm not going to want to celebrate that in any way. But if somebody sincerely has that belief, how are we going to change that? What methods are we to use into convincing someone that that belief isn't worth having? And I think that that's when we have to realize there has to be at least some methodology that we do with this, because just roasting people on Twitter, like, as much as I like that kind of stuff, it doesn't tend to change people's minds. And so, again, my name is Objectively Dan. My show is called Truth Wanted. If you're a fan of the atheist experience, we're produced by the same people, the atheist community of Austin. So it's a call-in show as well. Matt lives like 10 minutes from me. We hang out sometimes. It's fun. But I love doing that. My show is live every Friday at 7 p.m. Central Time, where I use street epistemology on people who call into my show, and I get a special guest every week. So you can check me out on there. Otherwise, that is my conclusion on street epistemology and how to do it. So thank you guys for letting me talk about that.